It's hard to imagine today, but for a very long time, the United States saw coastal defense as critical to protecting the nation. The U.S. was protected by its position. Most of our enemies would have to come across an ocean to get to us, but foreign fleets were a real threat and often far outclassed the United States Navy. Seems hard to justify the expense of building and manning dozens of fortifications, but protection of the U.S. harbors was not just critical to protecting trade, but also reduced the need to maintain a large standing army. In 1886, a specially designated Board of Fortification made recommendations about the state of U.S. coastal defenses that resulted in a huge construction and modernization program. Those fortresses represented the changing role that the United States was playing on the world stage at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Coastal fortifications were a concern in America from early on. For example, a fortification on the island of Newcastle, New Hampshire, located to protect the harbor of Portsmouth, was first established in 1632. First called the Castle, and after 1692 Fort William and Mary, the position was renamed Fort Constitution in 1808. The strategic location of the fortification meant that it figured prominently in many conflicts, including fighting against the Wabanaki Confederacy in the French and Indian Wars, and multiple engagements with the fortifications changing hands during the Revolution. Still, Congress's enthusiasm for coastal fortifications really depended upon perceived threat, particularly the political situation in Europe. Many grand plans were made only to have the fears of war recede and have the funding and the plans simply fade away. One interesting effect of the need for coastal defense after independence was the 1802 establishment of the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. America had few trained engineers, was reliant upon hiring foreign engineers to design protective fortifications. The idea of West Point was to train our own engineers. Typical of the attitude towards harbor defenses, it was the perceived threat. First the 1798 to 1800 quasi-war with France, and then the 1812 to 1814 war with the British, that led to the formal establishment, first of the Academy, and then much of the more formal set of rules for the Corps of Cadets. American coastal fortifications, although often outdated, performed well in the War of 1812. For example, Fort McHenry withstood British bombardment to defend Baltimore Harbor, a battle which inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Many coastal fortifications were tested during the Civil War, where it was made clear that masonry fortifications had not kept up with developments in artillery, and mighty fortifications fell to attacks by large-caliber rifled cannon. After the Civil War, there was little fear of foreign invasion, and the nation was focused on rebuilding after the war and westward expansion. There were a few new coastal fortifications built, but they were mostly designed around the idea of mounting the large cannon that were left over from the Civil War. By the 1880s, U.S. coastal defenses were outdated and in disrepair, but the national attitude was changing. In his 1884 address to Congress, President Chester Arthur called for a program to protect the nation's harbors, saying, "The Secretary of War submits the report of the Chief of Engineers as to the practicability of protecting our important cities on the seaboard by fortifications and other defenses able to repel modern methods of attack." Interestingly, Arthur didn't express the concern as a suggestion, but as an imperative, saying, "When the possible result of delay in making such preparation is seriously considered, delay seems inexcusable." Asking for the substantial sum at the time of $60 million, he noted it was a sum much less than a victorious enemy could levy as a contribution. So what changed so that after decades of neglect, suddenly U.S. coastal defenses were so important that we could spend huge sums of money on them? The latter half of the 19th century is a relatively understudied bit of U.S. history, and what study there is really talks about westward expansion in the Wild West. But actually, that period represented an era when the United States was starting to play a much larger role in world affairs. Arthur's 1884 address, while it expressed a commitment to peace, mentioned the arbitration of claims by American citizens for damages to their property during the War of the Pacific fought between Chile and Peru. The damage of American property in riots in Canton, China, the procurement of property for embassies to Korea, China, Japan, Siam, and Persia, and in a portent of the future conflict, Arthur expressed the importance of maintaining U.S. neutrality during the revolution against Spain in Cuba. As a sign of growing U.S. ambitions, Arthur dedicated a portion of his 1884 address to Congress to propose a treaty to allow a canal to be dug across Nicaragua. This one-time alternative to the Panama Canal presaged a period of U.S. expansionism, especially intervention, in Latin America. In brief, Arthur's call for new military fortifications on the coast represented a period when the U.S. was having much more muscular foreign policy, much of it to protect trade. Arthur was merely stating a political reality. If the U.S. wanted to play a larger role on the world stage, then the U.S. had to be much better prepared for the possibility of foreign attack. One example of the change was that it was under Arthur's administration that the allocations were approved to build 3 new cruisers, the so-called ABCD ships of the new Navy. The production of the protected cruisers, USS Atlanta, USS Boston, and USS Chicago, as well as the dispatch ship USS Dolphin, represented a change in the role for the Navy. They were seagoing vessels intended to be able to protect U.S. interests around the globe. Previous to that, the Navy had focused on monitors, vessels that were mostly used for coastal defense. As U.S. policy became less isolationist, its Navy became more interested in projecting power. This then placed more responsibility on the Army to defend the nation's coasts. Finally, the new demand for coastal defenses represents significant changes in technology. The existing coastal defenses still largely mounted Civil War-era cannon, but artillery had developed quite a lot in the industrialized 19th century. U.S. coastal defense guns were outclassed and outranged. That issue was also addressed in Arthur's 1884 speech, where he called for the development of a private steel works and 2 foundries, one for the Army and one for the Navy, able to produce larger, modern cannon for our ships and fortifications. The call for new and modern fortifications represented the needs and ambitions of a nation that was very different at the end of the 19th century than it had been at the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was a much larger part of a much more dangerous world. The development of the new fortifications would come under Arthur's successor, Grover Cleveland, who in 1885 appointed a joint Army, Navy, and civilian board called the Board of Fortifications, but usually referred to as the Endicott Board, named after the board's chairman, Secretary of War William Endicott, to make recommendations. The board's report in 1886 represented a dismal view of the state of U.S. coastal defenses and called for more than double the $60 million that Arthur had suggested to be allocated. The subsequent building program is often referred to as the Endicott period. The Endicott Era Fortifications differed substantially from previous designs. Instead of a single large fortification, these defenses were designed around multiple dispersed batteries. The batteries were generally constructed of reinforced concrete rather than masonry. Not only were the guns much larger and capable of firing longer ranges, they were breech loading, allowing them to be fired much more quickly and often rifled, being more accurate. What's more, the large guns of the Endicott fortifications were mounted on ingenious disappearing carriages. The carriage, which utilizes a counterweight, is designed so that the gun is lowered below the casement when loaded, and when ready, the carriage lifts the gun and recoil mechanism, some of which weighed more than 100,000 pounds, up above the casement to fire, and then lowers the gun back down so that it is fully protected, except from above. Disappearing guns not only protected the crews, and by protecting them from fire reduced strain upon them, they made batteries harder to spot and harder to hit. And they are marvels of design, not only raising and lowering the gun, but serving as a fulcrum between the gun and the platform, which lessened the stress on the platform. Thus, larger guns could be mounted with less damage being done to the fortification from the force of the recoil. The disappearing guns would be supplemented with massive coastal defense mortars. The 12-inch coastal defense mortar weighed more than 29,000 pounds, could fire 1,000-pound shells, and could fire to a range of more than 8 miles. Mortars dropped shells at a steep angle, making them particularly dangerous to ships, as even the most heavily armored battleships usually had very thin armor on their deck, and plunging shells could easily cripple them. Because they were fired at a steep angle, the mortars were fired from pits. They didn't have to be raised above the parapet. They could not be directly targeted, essentially firing from cover. The mortars were usually mounted in what was called Abbott quads, named after Civil War General Henry Larcom Abbott, an Army engineer who invented the design. The quad would mount 4 mortars in such a way that all could be loaded at the same time, although the pit would be quite full when doing so. As targeting was not exact, originally Endicott battery designs would include 4 quads, meaning 16 of the giant mortars would be firing at a rate of 1 round a minute each. This would lay down a pattern, something like a giant shotgun, that would make up for any targeting errors via sheer volume of fire, and also incite terror amongst the enemy. As targeting systems improved, batteries were reduced from 4 to 2 quads, and later only 2 mortars would be mounted per pit. The entire Endicott system was built to mount some 476 of these massive ordnance pieces. The fortifications also mounted a strange gun of the era, the Dynamite Gun. Early high explosives were too unstable to include in artillery shells, as the power of the explosion and rapid acceleration from firing the gun would cause the high explosive to explode in the barrel. Invented by D.R. Medford of Chicago, Illinois, and perfected by an American artillery officer named Edmund Zielinski, the dynamite gun solved the problem by using pneumatic propellant. The guns essentially threw a bundle of as much as 500 pounds of high explosives using compressed air produced by a steam-driven compressor. The guns required a huge amount of space to accommodate the gun, ammunition, a boiler, and compressor, all of which together weighed more than 200 tons. Depending upon the size of the explosive, the 15-inch dynamite guns of early Endicott fortifications could lob the explosive charges nearly 3 miles. To give an idea of the scope of the Endicott program, Fort Hancock, located in New Jersey and intended to protect New York Harbor, originally mounted batteries including 8 12-inch disappearing guns, 5 10-inch disappearing guns, 3 15-inch dynamite guns, and 16 12-inch mortars. The guns combined could fire more than 14 tons, or roughly 13,500 kilograms of ordnance in a single shot. That's more than 3 times the heaviest battleships of the era. In addition to the large guns, harbor defenses under the Endicott program included submarine mines. Unlike mines laid in the deep sea, these were controlled mines. The mines would be placed in strategic locations and remotely detonated by an observer when an enemy ship was determined to be within the mine's range. Eventually, as many as 10,000 such mines defended U.S. harbors. Additional rapid-firing guns were included in the gun batteries to protect the minefields from mine-sweeping vessels. The minefields resulted in another oddity of the period. Starting in 1904, small vessels were built for the Army, tasked with deploying and maintaining the mines. Dozens of specially designed vessels were operated by the Army, and an Army Mine Planter Service was established in 1918 and operated until it was dissolved in 1954. The fortifications of the so-called Endicott era were built between 1885 and 1905 at 26 locations along United States coasts. But only a few of the batteries had been completed at the outset of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Construction was accelerated, but the Spanish fleet, of course, never attacked United States shores. In 1902, additional funding was allocated to build similar fortifications to protect the Panama Canal Zone, and a further commission, chaired by then Secretary of War William Howard Taft in 1905, authorized fortifications in Hawaii and the Philippines. For all the effort and big guns, the coastal defenses faced little test. The only Endicott-era fortress to face combat was Fort Stevens, Oregon, which was fired at by a Japanese submarine in 1942. The attack did little damage, and the fort did not return fire. The Taft-era fortifications in the Philippines played a role in the defense of the Philippines, but were outdated by then, and most of the guns were pointed out to sea to defend Manila Harbor, proved of little use against the Japanese attack that came from land. The Endicott-era fortifications were maintained through the Second World War, but by the end of that war it was pretty clear that there was no real threat of attack on U.S. coasts, and the growing power of air power rendered such fixed fortifications essentially obsolete. They were all decommissioned by 1946, although some of the locations were used to mount new air defenses, including Fort Hancock, which eventually mounted Nike missiles. It's difficult to determine the real legacy of the Endicott-era fortifications. It was a lot of costs and a lot of forts and big guns that were never fired in anger. Like many military projects, the technology was essentially obsolete before the project was even completed, but it's possible that their presence might have deterred some conflict that might otherwise have occurred. What they did do was represent a new era in U.S. history and U.S. policy that represented both new fears and industrialization that represented new capabilities. The Endicott-era fortifications presaged the 20th century, when the United States would play a much more forceful role in world politics. Several of the Endicott-era fortifications have been preserved in various national parks and state parks, including some of the ordnance. Among those is Fort Constitution, which protected Portsmouth Harbor for nearly 330 years before it became a national park in 1961. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.